Welcome to another Museum FAQ video conversation. I'm Paul Orselli, President and Chief Instigator at POW, Paul Orselli Workshop here on Long Island. And I'm delighted to be joined today by Ashanti Davis. Hello, Ashanti, how are you?
Hello, I'm well. It is Monday.
Somewhere.
Monday somewhere. I'm always ready for a Monday.
So Ashanti, I always like to have the guests tell us a little bit about their background, because I always think it's interesting to hear about how people got to the place where they are now. And then after that, we'll start the conversation. So take it away.
Great. Thanks, Paul. I am the exhibition manager at the Fleet Science Center in San Diego, California. Love our 3-hour time difference here between New York and California. And I'm also a student. So I'm actually in a master's program right now with Johns Hopkins, studying for a master's in museum studies and a certificate in nonprofit management, which will be a great time. I'm almost done. But I have a little bit of like a weird, I'm not a science person. So it always seems interesting when I tell people that I work at a science center and they're like, so you must be a scientist. And I'm like, no, actually, I'm an artist. My undergraduate degree is in art design and media with combined studies, and we studied contemporary art. That's really kind of a space and love of mine. I was really interested in curatorial work, and really my medium of choice was installation. And so it kind of working and learning how to use tools really, and my love for tools and just creating things kind of navigated me through this space where I ended up working at a makerspace in the Science Center, and then developing exhibitions for the same Science Center. And now I'm the exhibition manager here, which is kind of it seems strange, but to me, it makes total sense. So I love it. Like I've had the most fun really working here and developing exhibitions and having conversations with people about science. And I wasn't, like a kid who was like obsessed with science. Like I didn't want to be a scientist, but I nerd out pretty hard on science. Like I don't get me into a conversation about black holes, and then like I'm there. I'm there for it. But yeah, it's just been, it's been a really kind of just gratifying experience to be able to work, I think, in a museum and do something that I wanted to do. I would say from the very beginning of my career. So.
Oh, that's awesome. And, installation to exhibits, that's not that far.
I don't think so.
Also, I actually think it's an advantage, probably, a lot of times that you're not a scientist, because obviously not all our visitors are scientists, just like not all visitors to history museums are historians. They just need to be people who have an interest in the subject, or whose interest can be ignited by people like us. So
yeah, I would say so few. I've gotten to work with scientists, which has been really fun, especially in developing exhibitions. But as we were having this conversation the other day, like we're not making exhibitions for scientists. We're making exhibitions.
We want to make our exhibits as accessible to as many people as always, of course.
Yes. Absolutely. So be it a scientist or someone who's like, what's science? Like I'm making things so accessible that I can touch all of those people is super critical. And it's been a lot of fun. Really, I think having those kind of deep conversations with scientists, I've loved it.
Well, I'm all for having fun in our work. If we don't enjoy what we're doing, why do we think visitors will enjoy it? So
yeah, or better yet, why are we doing it?
Yeah, that's true. Well, we could spend a productive conversation talking about exhibit development, but I have a little broader interest in mind, and why I invited you today, because we're in a sort of an interesting, let's say, a transitional period for museums, although maybe all periods are transitional periods for museums, whatever, but especially coming out of the pandemic and the worldwide impacts of COVID-19. you hear people, I'm sure you hear people, and probably in your master's program, you hear a lot of people say things like, well, we can't go back to the old normal, or we're moving into the new normal, or something like that. But what does that really mean in practice, or what could it mean? And so part of my sneaky reason for inviting you in particular, aside from the fact that you're a super smart person and like having fun in your work, which makes a big difference, is that, having somebody like me, who my kids always remind me I am old, even though I don't feel old, but they say, you're old. I'm interested in speaking with people who are a little earlier in their careers, and I'm going to say who have a more direct vested interest in the future of museums, because they are the ones who will be living through that future. And so that's what we want to talk about today. I know your crystal ball is no clearer than mine. Well, maybe it is, I don't know. But I'm really interested in getting your ideas and getting your opinions. Forget about prognostications or things like that. We won't go back to this video 10 years from now and say, boy, did they have it all wrong. Forget about that. We're not in the prediction business, but I am interested in what you might be thinking about, or what your peers, your cohort, people who are in the earlier stages of their careers, what are the things that maybe you wish would change in museums? I'm going to put it that way. That's sort of a slightly mean-spirited way of putting it, but there are things we all acknowledge that need to change in museums, that museums have been talking about in some cases for decades. And so rather than have you wait for decades for those changes, I'm wondering what kinds of changes you would like to help institute, or encourage viewers of this video to help institute, to make museums better. I'm going to say make museums better.
Yeah, I love that one. This is a great question, and something to think about. So COVID-19 has, of course, brought a really kind of just interesting kind of just space to the forefront, where there were worldwide closures of museums. Like, we weren't important, we weren't critical services, like people weren't needing to go to museums, like not important. So you are closed now. And I think that has really, part of that has presented, I think, what's really kind of a forward-looking approach for museums, is really thinking about how are we critical to our audiences, our communities? How are we valued by them? But I think the biggest part of this time, the pandemic, that has really impacted museums the most is not the coronavirus, but it's actually the social uprising and upheaval. I think that is the thing that is going to frame our future, just as a people, but really as museums. You said it, we've been having these conversations for such a long time, and about diversity, inclusion, equity, and accessibility, and about community, and right, we can go all the way back to the beginning of museums and how they were meant to be for people, and you can go back to the Temple of the Muses, the Library of Alexandria. We've always been for people, but it's been different kinds of people, right? It's been scholars, it's been educators, it's been, let's collect objects so we can bring our friends in to see these things that we've collected from around the world, to let's open our spaces to educate the public, because they are poor and they don't know any better, and it's our job to help them. And now as we're sitting in this time where we're coming out of this kind of being closed, And I hope what during closure has been kind of some soul seeking, and really coming to terms with the social upheaval, with the murder of George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor and countless others, and how, I remember when the protests kicked off in Minneapolis and what was happening, right, to museum spaces there, where it was just kind of like museums were just there, people were just, they were upset and they were wrecking things. And then how some museums were like, we're going to open our spaces and be open for protesters to kind of have a safe space and to use a restroom. And so we're seeing this kind of, a shift we saw. I remember the day it was after the murder of George Floyd, and we saw countless organizations putting out statements in support of Black Lives Matter. And then this kind of what seemed like some very authentic and some very performative posting of black boxes on blackout, on the blackout, I think it was a blackout Wednesday or blackout Tuesday. And this kind of misunderstanding of what that meant, like post a black box and that was it. Like, no, that was meant to blackout, that was meant to elevate Black voices at a time when the community of Black people were again experiencing so much. And we're also still in a pandemic. And so I think we're at this pivotal moment where museums really have to get it together. I'll quote Chris Taylor, in this notion of getting our houses right. Like, we need to get our houses in order. And I think we're going to see a divide. I think we're going to see the divide between those organizations that really just want to hold on to and maintain the old normal, the old way of doing this, right? We saw that with Newfields, with the incident with Newfields and the posting of that position and wanting to maintain their core white audience. And we're going to see the other side of that with people who are like, no, we have been and we will continue to get it together so that we can be valued by people, by all people, by our communities, by people who would never have stepped foot into a museum. So COVID, I think, we're gonna see and I love like a bifurcation, right? We're gonna see the kind of the fork in the road, and then I think from here it's gonna get really interesting.
Well, it's interesting because you articulated another fork in the road by distinguishing between actions that are, to use your words, performative versus authentic. And I think I share some of your concern that a lot of, well, let's just say some museum reactions seem like performative in the sense that like, I know these are the words we need to say, but we can't go back to the old normal. While really in their heart of hearts, it seems like everything they're doing is sort of pushing deliberately towards the old normal. So, this is sort of a tricky proposition because ideally what I would want to do if I was king of the world is I would like to reward in some way, or lift up organizations and museum workers who are being authentic as opposed to performative. But, then you get into sort of a sticky wicket, like so who determines who's authentic?
Right.
For one thing. Ideally the visitors do, but that maybe that's something we should talk about. This is obviously not just a conversation to be held within the hallowed walls of the Temple of the Muses and museum people and people in a museum organization or cultural organization just speaking to themselves. How do we as a field become more authentic and less performative in terms of including the communities we serve in this conversation?
We need to be held accountable, like this notion of accountability comes up a lot in this present time, right? So how are we asking communities of people to hold us accountable to these things that we're saying, right? So the call for, so when those statements went out, and before that, when organizations were posting equity statements and DEAI statements, right, and putting these things out. So you have the case of organizations who were having to do that because something happened, and so they were being reactionary versus being responsive to kind of what was needed. They were being reactionary to what happened. And then now, in an effort to be transparent, we have to post these things online so that everyone can see them. But I want to know, how are we asking our communities, people who are coming and people who aren't, to hold us accountable to the things that we say and do? And then on the flip side of that, let's go to the other side of accountability. So many of our organizations are members of the American Alliance and Museum, the Association of Science Technology Centers, the individual state organizations and the regional ones. So how are those organizations then also thinking about accountability, right? Because we talk about ethics. I know for AAM, like you have to hit a number of benchmarks before you can even really be an AAM certified organization. And so, like, when do we ask for accountability to happen there to even be a part of the organization? When do we ask for that, there be some evidence or something that you can show or something that you have to demonstrate at that level to be accredited by that institution? And then whether that be transparency, whether that be, whatever it is, like, when do we ask for it there so that we have it on both sides? So it's coming from this accreditation piece as a museum, and it's coming from this other piece as a community centered, or should be community centered piece. But how are you asking folks to hold you accountable? Like, what are you asking them to do? And then what is the work that you have to do as an organization to hear what communities and people might say to you? Because we're accustomed to the pat on the back, the great job, and the big donations and the accolades, but we're not accustomed to someone speaking a truth to us that's uncomfortable, that we don't want to hear, that we're not prepared to hear, and then reacting in a way, well, that's not true, or, oh, we didn't do that, or, oh, that was something else, right? So how really do we dig into white supremacy culture in our institutions, and how that prevents us from listening, and from really genuinely hearing people, and really thinking about how we have to change based upon what we're hearing, because we've asked people to hold us accountable to these statements, to being inclusive, to being equitable, to decolonizing. And so I think that's a really hard space to be in, because we've not been there before. We've not been accustomed to those truths.
Well, and these challenges within museums obviously intersect and echo with these challenges you mentioned earlier. I mean, there are, pandemic is obviously a public health challenge, but there are ongoing challenges that intersect related to social justice, related to climate change, related to equity or economic justice, both within and without the organizations. Those are challenges both inside and outside the museum, of course. Yeah. But I want to pivot this conversation a little bit, since I have a smart co-conversant here, and rather than talk about these institutional challenges, which are obviously important, but I think it is easy as an individual museum worker to get overwhelmed, where it's like, okay, how am I going to fix climate change? How am I going to fix the culture of the colonial or white supremacy culture inherent in many museums, like that can feel very daunting. It can feel sort of overwhelming, and that's so I'm always as an exhibits person, I try and be a practical person. So I'm like,
Mhm.
okay, what are some things that we can give people wherever they sit in the org chart, or whether they are currently employed in a museum? I call everyone a museum worker. You know, I'm an independent museum
Yeah.
professional, but I consider myself a museum worker because I care about museums and I want them to get better. And I continue to want to work with museums. So whether people, because, you know, people have lost their jobs and so they might not currently be employed in a museum, but they are still consider themselves, and I would too, museum workers. So what are some things that we might give, or you might give, to museum workers to grab onto, who you know, listen to the first part of this conversation and say, yeah, those are challenges, and I agree, those are things that museums and society in general need to come to grips with. But
Yeah.
what are some things that I, as an individual museum worker, could do to contribute to making museums better? I mean, what do you think about that?
So you asked a really interesting question about like things that I'd like to see change, and I think the one of those shows up here in a really big way. So um, museums, the way that they have operated, and of course, it's not all museums, but the institution, the ideology of the museum. Um, Structurally, everything has been very much top down. And again, I'll say it again: the white cultural supremacy that shows up in those spaces means that we work as individuals, not communities. There's these aspects of worship of the written word and fear of open conflict and paternalism. And so there's all of these things that happen. And I would quote Adrienne Marie Brown on this and her emergent strategy on a macro level. And it's exactly the same on the micro level. And so I think museum workers, all of us as individuals, need to do our own individual work. We are not, I mean, unless you want to, we're not here to change the larger system, because that is really going to require so many more people. But the larger system is reflected, just as you said, on the micro level. And so if we are doing our own individual work, and on that smaller level, and then thinking about and reflecting about those elements and how they show up in our spaces, and most importantly, our spheres of influence, be it in exhibits or in development or in marketing, right? How are these things showing up in how we are engaging with our communities, whether they come to the Science Center or museum or history center or, you know, wherever, or don't. And so that requires reflection. And another thing that we don't like to do, right? We don't want to reflect. We don't want to no, I don't want to think about that. I just want to keep moving forward, except now when we want to go back to the old ways, because those were so much better.
It's interesting that you talk about sort of the primacy of the written word. Like there are lots of things written about reflection and museums and museum work and informal education. But I would be hard pressed to think of many museum worker colleagues, either those currently employed in museums or those who are independent museum professionals, who feel like, well, I have time to reflect all the time. Like that like, I mean, if there was one gift that the pandemic gave us, it might be time. You know, it might be like this magic pause button, the universal pause button that was pressed.
Right.
But well, so how could, I mean, I agree, like well, we're reflecting now in a way. Mm-hmm. It's nice. Mm-hmm. But maybe this is what you meant when you said people need to do the work themselves. I mean,
yeah,
to make the time for reflection.
Yep. The individual work is critical. And time, like we could get into a really deep discussion about time. Time is a construct, like, right? Someone somewhere one day made up time. They were like, it is now 1 o'clock. And you're like, oh, okay. Obviously based upon observations and movements of our planet and kind of what's happening, but somewhere someone was like, this is time and this is a year, right? So someone said it 365 days. If someone had said, you know what, it takes 570 years to get around the sun, everyone would have been like, okay, right?
It depends what planet you're talking about.
Right? It depends on what planet. It depends on what planet. So there's time is, I think, such a big factor for us, especially as museum workers, because I think we're constantly trying to pile on more. And there's another factor of that white supremacy culture. More is more. And there's just more. Just do more. Like, we must do more. Do you really have the resources and the physical capacity to do more? Because like as we talk about, especially now during COVID, the experience of people experiencing burnout and then leaving because more is being put on to plates, and it's like, I have one plate, and it reminds me of, right, that Thanksgiving plate that you just pile high with food. Like, no, you cannot eat all of that.
Then you sleep, then you take a big
right
nap.
And then you have to take a big nap, right? And so no, we physically cannot do more. And so the thing that I would like to see, there's another thing that I'd like to really see change in addition to individual work, is the cultural environment that we've created for our staff communities. I would really like to see in this work with an acknowledgement of communities that we serve as museums, as nonprofits, right? We're 501c3s. I would really like to see the acknowledgement of museum workers as a community that we also serve, because, and I've had this conversation in multiple spaces, if your staff are worked to death, they're going to leave. Their health will be impacted. They might have to spend more time away from work because you continue to pile things onto our organizational plate that we must do more. We must do more. And you're really doing a disservice, and you're doing damage to the people who at one point were excited to join your organization and were committed to your organizational mission. And so now you're doing harm to a community of people, and that has to change. Because at the end of the day, if all of your staff left, who's going to be there to do all of that stuff that you asked your organization to do? Who's going to do all that stuff?
Yeah, that's a little tricky. I mean, this triangulation too, inside museums and outside of museums, because traditionally, as you know,
yep,
there are certainly for entry level or front of house or sort of beginning stage career aspects of museums, there are many more applicants than spaces available. And so, this is sort of the harsh supply and demand story. Well, okay, I don't,
yep.
if you have that mindset, I'm not saying it's a good institutional mindset, but if you are just like really into the supply and demand aspect of it and not the humane aspect of it, you're like, well, if you don't like it, leave. There's 4 or 5 other people who would take this job in a minute. And so, maybe that also triangulates with the I'm going to say, often poor museum pay and benefits conversation, and perhaps why there has been, even before COVID, a burst of union activity in museum, which is a whole different conversation. But I like, see, maybe you are more of a science person, or maybe that's an art thing too, talking about time as a concept. So that
I love philosophy.
interesting to me. So
I love philosophy. So that's where I feel like for me, that's where my art and my science intersect, because philosophy it's philosophical. It's like, it's fascinating. But yeah, that piece of the number of available positions and who can do these jobs.
Well, it just I guess what I was going to say, where it triangulates to outside museums, is now we see that now that the world is sort of waking back up again, and now like, oh, we need restaurant workers or frontline workers for organizations, not museums, and oh, people don't want to work in a sort of a dicey situation or a low pay or an exploitive sort of situation.
Yeah.
So lo and behold, they have to raise the pay rates, and
Finally.
grudgingly, but still raising them. And so, I mean, it'd be interesting to see if that happens in the museum world at all, or how some of these unionization efforts, how that might echo through the halls of museum workers.
That feeds like that nonprofit narrative, right? Like, we're nonprofits and nonprofits don't make money, which is a lie. Nonprofits, having just taken a finance class for nonprofits and having the wonderful joy now of being able to like check out organizational 990s.
Yeah,
I have seen
990s tell you the real story about who's making money in an organization.
I have seen nonprofits that make like their revenues $85 million. $85 million revenues. Like I've seen over like 100. I've seen on 990s the number of revenues. And then, the other thing I love about 990s is posting like, how much is your CEO making, or like the kind of top people in organization.
Top 10.
Yeah. So I love that. I love that kind of just, let's feed into this belief that nonprofits don't have to make money, or they don't make money. No, nonprofits can make money. They just don't make profits. Like, please stop confusing. They're not making profits and then sending out checks to stakeholders on a regular basis. Like, stop feeding that narrative.
And also, who are the people promoting that narrative?
Right.
Who have a vested interest in promoting that narrative. But that again is a whole additional conversation.
And then you get into also the piece around overhead, and it's because of the relationship between donors and overhead. Therefore, we must pay our workers abysmally. We must pay them poorly, and then tell them, well, I can't, like, really, like, no. So you could. But you really, it takes, I think, a reframing of priorities, right? I know there's a case, and this was like a couple years back. There was a CEO of a tech organization, and of course, for profit, but bad example, but good example. CEO of a tech or company in, I want to say it was Washington, and he decided that everyone in the company, himself included, made the same amount, right, every year. And it was something like everybody made something like 70K or 90K or something, everyone, all across the board. And like in cases like, and everyone's like, you're crazy, except those are some of the happiest people working for that organization. And it's just like, you have to think really critically about making those decisions. And like, what are, we want people to live healthy lives, right? We want people to have access to the things that they need. That feels so human. But when we pulled the humanity out of everything, when we pulled the humanity out of museums, right? And it became, for some spaces, objects and collections or just donors. When you pulled the humanity of it, then of course it's easy to maintain low wages or have really crappy benefits, or like just really disregard people needing time off.
Well, that's how you get to the statement of some museums when they said, well, we're protecting our core. And so you're telling me like, obviously I understand the importance of collections to a collection-based organization and physical plant. You have buildings, you need to take care of them. I'm not saying you just sort of let them turn to dust or defer maintenance.
Yep.
But it's really an interesting choice of words when you explain how or why you furloughed or laid off or fired, whatever you want to say, a whole bunch of people. But you did that to protect the core. I mean, that might be one of the worst things I've heard repeated from museums and cultural organizations, because
Right.
that's just saying, well, our staff are not part of our core. I'm like,
well, and how that's done, right, too. So we've seen organizations furlough like their entire team except for their organizational leadership. We've seen other organizations actually utilize equity in doing furloughs and doing reforecasting of budgets, and kind of like trying to utilize an equity lens when making those decisions. And so, and then everything in between, and literally everything in between. We saw organizations, I want to say it was a museum in Washington State, who I would say they might have specifically targeted the staff members who were kind of really rallying the unionized.
Troublemakers. We want to get
the troublemakers, right?
Here.
Right. And then intentionally firing them to furlough everybody else to kind of show an example. So there's just been everything across the board. But what I've really loved is museum workers rallying together to, and I'll go back to that accountability, please, take these organizations to task. You know, I was in a Twitter thread when the Newfields that job description was posted, and that happened. And then I subsequently was a part of the kind of piece that went out of signing a petition and calling for and demanding change. And then just subsequently seeing the number of, and it wasn't just this past year, but before that, of museum workers coming together and taking their organizations to task, demanding change. And so if there's another thing that I want to see change for museums, it's us really, really kind of exploring this social kind of responsibility space that we have. You know, museum workers should be able to hold their organizations accountable. They work there. And if you are doing things that are counter to what you are saying, or if you are doing things that are counter to what should be happening, then you should expect open letters. You should expect articles being published in the newspaper about you. You should expect your staff holding you accountable for injustices, for upholding racism and white supremacy in your institutions. You should expect it. Which means you should probably work harder to do your own work to ensure that that doesn't happen. So I've really enjoyed just the willingness of museum workers to step in and speak and really find our protest, right? Find our place of protest in demanding change. Because again, we could demand change of the larger system, but that's not our space of influence. Our space of influence is with cultural organizations. So why not demand change there, which is again, a micro version of what's happening on the macro level. Demand change there and call for it, and hold organizations accountable. And yeah, that's hard, especially when it happened very locally here for us with a museum here, right here in Balboa Park. And it's very hard when people are put into positions where they have to worry about job security because they don't know how the organization is going to respond. But then you have people who are willing to, say, nope, like I will let this go. I'm going to, I quit. And now I'm going to do something about it. Right. I'm going to rally together all those other people who quit already because they were frustrated, and we're going to do something about it. And we're going to speak openly. And we've seen change because of it. Is it enough? No. Is it a start? Yes.
All right. Well, if ever there was a video call to action, Ashanti has just given it to you. I'm telling you, she's a troublemaker, but she still has her job. So there's also a lesson in there somewhere. So
I've been, you know what, I've been very, and I cannot say this for all of my colleagues. I have been very fortunate to have a leader at my institution who is open, is doing their work, is kind of, and when we started it, we have a DEA, we call it our idea group. It's actually called People and Culture here at the Science Center. And we started, I actually one of the people who started it about, I want to say 3 years ago. And I've been with the organization for, we're approaching 8 years at some point. So I feel like I've been here for a while. And I'm a little bit of a troublemaker, and I'm totally okay with that. But having someone in a position who says, go and do, who's not trying to hold on to the reins.
Yeah, if there's a problem, so how can we fix it? Like, what can we do about it? I mean, and
right?
It gives you the space to do something about it.
Right. But really, I think even ask the question, not even what do you all want to do about it? So when we started that group, it really was a group started by staff who were kind of like, okay, we have to do something. But it wasn't an initiative that was started in the executive office. It really was led from the bottom up. And now we've come to this really wonderful place where we are working across the organization with people representative of all of those different levels and spaces to create change. But I would say that I've been very fortunate to have a leader who is willing to do that, willing to step back and say, okay, like, what do we need to do, and listening, and also continuing to learn. I know that that's not the same for some of my colleagues across the country. So it's wonderful to be in that space, but it also kind of prepares me to think about, like, okay, what happens when I move somewhere else where I don't have that luxury? And so you asked another thing, right? Like, what for all of us as individuals doing our own work, but also leading from where we are. The leaders of our organizations, the traditional space that they occupy might be that C-suite, or maybe perhaps even your directors, your VPs and things like that. But we're all leaders. We all have the capacity to lead from where we are. So it doesn't matter if you are at the ticket counter of your museum, or a custodian at your museum, or you work you're a registrar, or you work on the floor, or you're a security guard, or you are in a director seat or a manager seat, wherever you are. We all can lead from where we are. And I think that's another thing that we can do in addition to doing our work, is how do we lead from where we are, and how do we embrace that the power that we have, that might not be the power and decision-making power, but that power of influence that we have, and really exploring that and what we can do with that. I think that's another critical place for us as museum workers and as individuals.
Well, that seems like a great note to end on. And since we will ultimately end up in YouTube land, I'm sure Ashanti has some references or links to share relevant to the conversation. And I'm sure she can pull from her work at Johns Hopkins, so that's too. But Ashanti, I really want to thank you. I appreciate you taking the time and sharing your thoughts today. Thank you for the
invitation.
You bet.